this house. It was a historic day when I once strolled into this chamber. First, seeing a young Welshman in the chair, looking rather dapper, the officers looking rather regal in their black tie. Of course, as a Cuthboy, I'm not used to anything really formal. We pretty much live in a tip. The majesty, the aura, it overpowered me. And there was an interesting issue that was first being debated. The questions to the floor, the historic speakers, the idea of challenging an authority, the disproving of a potentially valorous cause. Some would say the ending of an ideology, a way of life, a reason to be for some policymakers. What was debated was the issue of Iraq, the issue of whether or not neoconservative foreign policy can be justified and whether or not it would be an idea. And what we say today from St Cuthbert's B and from First Proposition is ultimately we think the US and the UK did challenge the UN. We think they did challenge conceptions of authority and they challenged conceptions of law and things which govern behaviour, and we think they've been proved wrong in time. So what we're going to do today from First Proposition is quite simple. We're going to say that we shouldn't intervene in other states in order to enforce our moral cases. We're going to say specifically we don't think we should intervene in order to cause democracy, and we don't think states have a duty to do that. I'm going to address two main issues in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about instability in these areas when we launch military operations. Secondly, I'm going to talk about demonising democratic ideals and stopping development in the long run. Sam's going to move on and talk about extremism, conflict and ideology. But in terms of exactly what we're proposing and the exact model, what we simply want to say is we don't think you should be able to act in order to say that one form of government is better than another, and we don't think you should enforce that. We realise that's not the only issue that's happened in Iraq, but we want to talk about the principles of democracy and weighing that up over war and other forms of policy. So, firstly, instability. So we say ultimately, in these countries where you have anti-democratic forces, in these countries where you have a small clique or one dictator ruling a country, a huge group with an iron fist, some would say, we say yes, some bad things happen. But what happens when you decide to go in and remove that government? When you decide to go in and cause a war and ultimately remove them by force? When you have 18-year-olds, wide eyes, guns blazing, going in, is you have war. You have war which is bad because people get killed. People have the very essence of themselves and their lives ripped from them. They're wounded and they lie bleeding to death in a gutter as their lives slowly ebb away and destroyed. We say we don't think we should place this thing below some kind of abstract concept of self-rule or of democracy. We say two reasons why that. One, because you can't rule yourself when you're dead, but moreover because we don't think like democracy is a right that can be trumped by life. We think it's one you can access when you're alive, but we say ultimately there's no use in having democracy if you are dead. We say the instability in wars, yeah, go on.
Okay, we first of all say that the reason we have a moral obligation to do this is that we live and benefit by what we are granted. We think that we have a better standard of life, and because we have the ability to enact this change, we owe it to the rest of the world to give them the same opportunities and chances we've been given.
I don't think a land full of car bombing, shooting and ethnic warfare is really a better form of life for these people. We say ultimately you cause more war and you cause more death when you go into these places, and you cause more problems in the long run. Why? One, because in these cases you are likely to be up against a good army, especially if it's an anti-democratic leader who has kept himself despite popular will being against him. You have security forces that you have to fight and you have to kill, and your people will die in that process, and civilians will die in that process. We say furthermore, when you just remove a government, take the top off and don't deal with any underlying causes or allow any form of natural progression or evolution in this case, is you get a perpetual civil war and you get problems. Why? One, because factions that would interact within the democratic processes firstly see their only way to gain a stake as to fight against people, as to take down other people, and as to ultimately attempt to gain force, so that when it comes to the post-conflict reconciliation, they're holding the cards and they can take power in the long run. What happens there is you get a factionalised political fight where people are fighting tooth and nail for ends that never come, and when you get more and more civil war and more death. But you get furthermore people settling old scores from the years of repression. For example, what happens in Iraq when the regime was removed, was you had Kurds and you had other repressed minorities who were going and trying to launch their own attacks against the people
Yes,
who have
sir.
oppressed them historically. We said the problem with that is you can never build a viable state, you get a perpetual civil war, and ultimately you never make people's lives better, and you never give them the moral obligation that Tom talked about. We said when you try and remove regimes in this way, you cause death, you cause destruction, and we say a moral obligation of democracy is not worth that. But we say, even if we do want to give these people democracy, we think this is potentially the worst way to go about it. Because when you do go in, and when you cause people to bleed to death in the Gaza, and when you cause people to die for that notion, when you have car bombs, and when you have a literal hell on earth in Iraq or in anywhere else, no matter how noble your goal is, or no matter how despicable your goal is, the fact is the tool you are using itself causes death. It causes destruction. We say that's bad on its own, and it's generally not good for the people who are dying to die for that abstract notion. But what happens is you undermine the cause of democracy within these countries. One, because people begin to question its worth. They say, is it really worth this self-rule? Is what we want really worth my brother or my mother or my sister or my father dying? And ultimately we say, when you need faith and you need people to believe in that political system and to understand that political system and want to support it, the worst thing you can do is to get people to question its worth. But we say furthermore it becomes inextricably tied to the fact. The fact is that you may have got democracy, but it comes tied to the fact that your brother died, that your mother was shot in the street, that your father got killed by a car bomb. Not only does this add to the question of the worth that I talked about in the first case, but ultimately it means that democracy as a goal is tied to that tragedy. People will no longer support it, and it inextricably means that when they think democracy, they think of what it cost them. They think of the death, they think of the destruction, and that means that democracy loses its support when it's weighed up against anything else. You don't have long-standing democracy, because it means that when they want to balance up X issue and Y issue, they're going to err on the side of caution of not having any kind of conflict, of not going with the democratic side, and ultimately reverting back if it means people don't die. We tell you two things from first proposition. Firstly, we tell you that we don't put democracy above the abstract concept, that we don't put democracy above people's right to life and their right not to die. Secondly, we tell you that even if we did, you undermine every cause of democracy when you act in this way. We're extremely happy to propose, we're extremely happy to not fight the law again, because the law won. Thank you.